Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, I present the bill and move that the bill be read a first time and printed. Just second time? I'm sorry.
The second reading.
Thank you. Mr President, in fact, I move that the bill be read a second time. Thank you. I foreshadow to the House, Mr President, that in committee the government will move two amendments to this bill that have been circulated to members as far as I know. The first amendment would change the commencement date of the bill from 1 May 2020 until 1 July 2020, and the second amendment would insert a review provision into the bill. And I'll deal further with those amendments in committee. I seek leave to make some very short comments, which I have been given approval to do. I know as a parliamentary secretary I ordinarily would not do so, but given the content, I have been given permission to just make some very, very brief personal comments, and then I will seek leave to incorporate the second reading speech in Hansard.
Make the comments. I don't believe you need to seek leave to make the comments. You'll seek leave when you want to incorporate.
Thank you.
the rest of your speech.
Thank you, Mr President. I was referring to leave from the Minister and his advisors. Self-preservation.
It is leave. Not when I'm in the chair.
Thank you, Mr President. The government's pleased to introduce this Evidence Amendment Tenancy and Coincidence Bill in this House 2020. It represents another significant reform by the government in response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The Commonwealth Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse was an extensive 5-year inquiry which documented the experiences of people affected by child sexual abuse in an institutional context and revealed the extent of the horrific abuse that affected far too many children and young people across the nation. Mr President, I for many years practiced for my sins as a lawyer and mostly did so in commercial litigation and building construction, but for some part of the time I practiced it was in relation to sexual abuse matters. Whilst not lengthy, it was a significant part of the practice time that I spent in practice, and it behoves me to just acknowledge some of the experiences during that time that I bring to this chamber, as we all do in our own ways. Mr President, it was only 3 weeks after I first joined this place as a member. I've been hanging around the joint for a little bit longer, not as a member, but 3 weeks after that, the Royal Commission released its final report on the 15th of December 2017 and made a number of recommendations in that final report. That came about after many, many years of practitioners trying to get redress and trying to get justice for victim survivors of child sexual abuse, and many, many claims did not result in satisfactory outcomes for those victim survivors, and they were just the ones that were alive. Many were not alive to be able to bring these proceedings, and it was a privilege on my part to act on their behalf in many of those claims. My husband and I ran a number of matters, but one significantly to the High Court in Australia, which was unsuccessful and gave rise to what was known as the Ellis defence. And I know Mr Shoebridge has spoken about that at length. That in essence was the Catholic Church saying you can't sue us. And in no small part was that devastating to us and to our client, John Ellis, who then went on to play no small part in reform in this area and has acted for hundreds and hundreds of clients also. Part of that, we like to think, in a terrible way, gave rise to the path that gave rise to the Royal Commission. And in some small part, that has been something that we have been very proud to have been a part of. And I sat with a number of clients through private sessions and drafted statements for them for the Royal Commission. And I must say that the commissioners were exceptional in the work that they did and the way they handled those claims. And it was a privilege to act on behalf of those clients and walk with them on that journey, as horrific as it was. And I just would like to recognise the strength and courage of those survivors who have in their process, advocated for meaningful systemic changes in response to the Royal Commission and for their bravery. What happened to them can never be undone, but their advocacy, their survival, their persistence has achieved a safer future for children, and they are children, and a better, more responsive criminal justice system. Their advocacy has led to the reforms proposed today, and I would suggest some of these are the most significant. Specifically, this is in relation to tenancy and coincidence evidence, Mr President, and during my time practising, in order to establish tenancy and coincidence, which is not ordinarily admitted by the Evidence Act, I interviewed at one stage 20 schoolboys in the same year at a school in a boarding house to try and establish tenancy and coincidence, and every single one of them had to give me their story, and their bravery and honesty and willingness to speak to me after so many years is to be commended, and I thank them for their trust in doing so. I'll leave my comments there, other than to say that the New South Wales Government formally responded to the Royal Commission on the 23rd of June 2018 and accepted the overwhelming majority of the recommendations. And I'm so very pleased to be able to have the privilege of standing in this chamber to be able to see these reforms come to fruition. I'll leave it there, Mr President, but I now seek leave to have the second reading speech incorporated in Hansard.
Is leave granted?
Yes.
There being no objection, the honourable member may proceed. The Leader of the Opposition.